Hello, hi. So I'm back to talk about The Magicians. Let's do a quick recap, review, talk through of The Magicians Season 5, Episode 3, The Mountain of Ghosts. I'm looking at my laptop here because I have it here and I have my notes here. So this episode it definitely gave me, more grieving. So, I think all of the characters were grieving, and so I want to talk about it was interesting seeing the different ways that people grieve and how grief can sometimes have external benefits. So, we start off at the very beginning where we find out that there is some type of residual outcome, things left over from the spell that Alice did to create a golem imbibed with Q's essence, or his soul, imbibed with a bit of his soul in the prior episode. And so that's something that I wanted to note, and that is always interesting to me because I don't know if it's something that I see regularly in these kinds of shows where the magicians, they have all this power, they have this magic, but everything is still done in a very kind of immature, unthought out fashion. So it's Alice is mourning the loss of the love of her life, for the most part in this time, and she gets a bit of his soul and turns it into a golem. Of course, it doesn't come back as the Q that she wanted. It comes back as 12, preteen tween Q. And so it's this spell, this spell well enough to do it. Did you not think that it could turn out to be like Q in a different form? Same thing here, they do this. She does the spell, and not only, after everything kind of works out, there's still the leftover essence, his soul, that you still have to take care of. And so it's just whenever they do stuff, it's very interesting. I think that's an interesting quirk, and it's nice kind of seeing what that looks like as they get older, but they're not teenagers, they're young adults, early 20s. But there's always some type of things never quite work out as simply as it seems like they should. And so I actually find that's a positive, in my opinion, because then it makes them feel more flawed, makes them feel more human, like people, and not just these super powerful magicians. So of course at the very beginning, and I wrote, of course there are residuals of Alice's golem spells, because that's just kind of how things go on this show. But the magicians, they do these things, and then there's almost always some type of after effect that has to be tackled and taken care of. So we have another episode where Alice is still kind of working through her grief of losing Quentin, but this time she goes on the journey with Eliot. Whereas in last episode she kind of went on the journey with Julia, but this time she goes on the journey with Eliot. And what they do, so apparently there's this mountain that is in Fillory, and the mountain is rumored myth that there's the hole in the mountain, if you drop something in, it'll go all the way down to the underworld. So Alice is okay, and apparently they say it's a myth, but it's really just that's the mountain, that's what happened. So Alice decides, all right, I'm gonna travel to Fillory, travel to this mountain so I can drop the rest of Q's soul to give it back to him. And Eliot kind of peeps that Alice is, doing something, because of course she didn't say this, and so he basically forces his way onto the trip. So he demands, no, I'm going with you. You don't have a choice. And I was interested to see that journey because Alice and Eliot aren't really close. They're not close, but they're not as close as they are with some of the other characters. And I cannot remember which season, a few seasons ago, when they had the different timelines, and Eliot and Q got stuck on that one timeline where they basically were in a relationship They lived out their lives together. It was them. They had a wife. So they were really, it's like a polyamorous relationship. They lived out their life together. Like they grew old together, and eventually, what I can't. I think Eliot died first in the timeline, and then when Eliot died, that kind of finished the timeline, and that in that particular episode, I don't remember the specifics of what happened around that, of course, because that was a couple of seasons ago. They, ended up back on their timeline. But what happened was something happened in kind of the process of them getting back to their timeline, where they remembered their relationship, and they were a couple. They were in love. They built a life. They had, like I said, they had a wife. They were in love with the wife. They all were together. They had a child. The child grew old. The child grew up and came back. Like they had this whole life, and they loved each other deeply in this timeline. And when they made it back to their timeline, they remembered that they loved each other deeply. So from that season on, Eliot and Quentin had this deep love for each other that went well beyond friendship. Like they weren't just friends. They loved each other. They were in love with each other, but the way that it manifested, the way that they participated in that was they weren't like physically intimate with each other, but they had this really deep level of intimacy, and that I find that pretty cool, because it just offers a broader look into the different kinds of relationships that you can have with people. So like in the timeline with Eliot and Quentin, they were in a polyamorous relationship where it was them, and they had a woman who was their partner, whose name I also cannot remember, but she was a person. I just don't remember her name right now. And like they were together. Like I said, they had a child, they had a daughter, they raised the daughter. Like they were in a relationship with this woman. But then when they made it back to their main timeline, they retained those feelings for each other. They were genuine, true, deep love, but they didn't date each other. Like they both went and Eliot is I was gonna say he's homosexual, but I don't know if he's homosexual as much as he might be. I would say maybe bisexual. No, he might be pansexual. As I think back about Eliot, like Eliot is, I would say, but I don't know that it's ever been explicitly stated. So I would just, thinking about what I know from watching this show from season 1 to now, that Eliot very likely makes sense to fall in the pansexual category. But they went back to their own timeline. Eliot continued his, he had like a whole dating situation, like in another season after that. Quentin and Alice had their relationship that kind of had its ups and downs, but they ultimately fell in love as well and loved each other. And so it was I appreciate that, because it showed, that was one of the things that Eliot really needed to grieve, because when he was possessed by the god in season 4, he was possessed like the entire season. So it's like him and Quentin, he didn't see Quentin before he died, because as soon as they brought Eliot back, they went to do their thing, and then Quentin died. So it's like, he essentially lost the love of his life, and he was there but not there, and that was just one of those many things that Eliot, you can tell that he was dealing with and needed to grapple with. So I thought it was interesting, seeing Eliot and Alice kind of take their journey to deliver the rest of his soul to the mountain, because they essentially, like, it was their lover that they were delivering, and watching them kind of go through that journey with each other, I thought it was kind of beautiful. And they, said their goodbyes and delivered Q, and then into his essence, his soul into the mountain. But then Eliot kind of he tells her about him and Quentin, but Alice is like, they really had her and Eliot really had like a deep connection and bond, and they really knew each other. And she's like, yeah, I knew. Like, and I couldn't be mad that he was in love with you and he was in love with me like that. I can't tell him who to be in love with. I just, have to respect and appreciate what we have. And it was a bit of a tearjerker. It got a little dusty as I watched that, seeing Eliot release that part of the grief, and it was just like, right. And so him and Alice kind of saying their goodbyes and coming closer, and she appreciating that he told her because he didn't have to, but that they still had to have that moment. So one of the notes I made, I hope it will be interesting to see as I watch the rest of this season if the Alice and Eliot bond like deepens any because of their shared deep love for Quentin. So that was really nice. That was kind of a part, really, that was my favorite part of the show, of this episode. Speaking of just additional mourning, Julia is still mourning Q, but her mourning is she tries to, put practicality behind her mourning. So she's like channeling her energy into figuring out what's going on with the magic burst, and she finds the sisters, and one of the sisters, her abilities, she can predict circumstances is what they call it, which is kind of the magic is it surges, by circumstances and premonition. Circumstances, I think is what it was. I'm looking forward in this recap just so I can say the correct name. But I thought it was dope. It looked like the lady from American Gods, who I think is beauteous, but also, a wonderful actor. So it's nice seeing her in some other stuff. I believe that was her. I'll have to double check it after I finish this video, and then I will share in the comments whether it was her or not, and I'll put a link and all that good information so you can see what I'm talking about. But it was cool seeing, the Black women show up and having this power. And so her name was PK Endeavors, and her sister's name was Daniela. I'm sorry. Her name was Zoe Marcus, and her sister is Daniela, and she could predict the magical herb surges. So Julia is still kind of channeling her energy into problem solving. Penny is supporting her in that. I think it also helps him to, dive deeper into what's going on with her to kind of help her through Quentin, but it kind of helps him too. And then he can kind of get to know things, it helps them kind of create a relationship and have their own relationship outside of him and his issues with timeline and kind of how they felt like this is kind of their courting time. It was helpful, and because there, so I'm thinking like, not much happened. It wasn't super engaging, but it was one of those subplots where it's like it's going to move the story along, because the thing that came out of them, not only her just kind of working through her problem solving, but also there is a harmonic convergence, which is this very powerful magic event that's supposed to happen in 2 weeks. So we know that that's going to come back around, and that's definitely going to probably bring everyone together in the same story plot. But that one was happening, and then we have Margot and Finn and Josh having their thing, and I guess they're kind of mourning, but there's a couple of different things are happening. So Margot, I'm sure, is mourning kind of the loss of her kingdom because she was the king of Fillory. And then Josh and Finn are, I don't know if they're mourning as much as they're just appreciative that they didn't die, weren't killed. So it's a little bit less, I guess, less about mourning and more just about them having their journey. But one thing we do discover, so Margot, Josh, and Finn are in Fillory, and they go back for this, apparently Josh created this tradition where they'd have like a battle of fighters to fill out their Centurion Guard, which would be like their elite guard group. And so they're like, oh, it's happening right now, we should go. And Margot decides to enter to fight to be a Centurion. She's trying to get back into Fillory. And then so the thing was, if you if you become a part of the Centurion Guard and win this battle, then they will essentially expunge all of your crimes from your record. So they'll just no longer exist. And Margot is currently banished from Fillory. And so that would lift her banishment. So they go back to do that so she can try to get back into Fillory, get her kingdom. And then they find out there's a full moon coming. So Margot and Josh, of course, they're werewolves. They start to have, symptoms. So does Finn. So apparently, but it was 300 years. So in the time, 300 years when Margot, hadn't come back and all that time had passed, Finn and Josh had gotten close. And then they got really close, and then they got super close. And Finn became a werewolf because, werewolf is a sexually transmitted situation. So it's interesting. And then, of course, Finn and Margot, make it to the Centurion Guard, but because Fillory is super duper duper ultra antiquated in their beliefs, they're like, there could only be one woman Centurion Guard. They say female, but I refuse. One woman Centurion Guard, and they make Finn and Margot fight. But this is after Margot has found out that Finn is about to be a werewolf, which means that her and Josh have done the diddly do, and she tries to kill her. So Finn thinks that Margot didn't try to kill her, but Margot was like, no, I really did try to kill you. And I guess Margot is reckoning with the fact that she's just not a nice person. But she kind of has these moments of, Margot was kind of the typical mean girl type character. She has these moments where it's like she'll go through this existential crisis of some kind, so it feels like that's coming. So we'll have to see what happens there. But that was, sometimes when they get a little too crazy with the Fillory stuff, it's just like, what's happening? But that was another thing that kind of pushed the story along. Of course, the big thing was Alice and Eliot, and they had their moment, which I thought was great. We didn't see Katie in this episode, which happens, but the Alice Eliot situation with Quentin, I think that was, like I said, that I really enjoyed that story. I really enjoyed seeing that play out. I really hope that Eliot and Alice get closer. And we found out that they also met the Dark King while they were going in the mountains and making their way up to the top. And so that was interesting too. So I'm sure that's one of those subplot points that's gonna come back up. But yeah, this was a nice episode. There's always episodes during the Magicians that kind of feel like Fillory. So when you start watching them, it's kind of like, this feels like, what is going to happen? How is this going to make sense? But then by the time you get to the end, you're like, oh, okay, so I see what we're doing. We're establishing some things and setting some stuff up for later, while also, addressing a major plot point. So that's kind of what this felt like. But I was really happy to see Eliot and Alice kind of go on their journey. So we'll see what happens in the next episode. So what are your thoughts? What do you think about The Magicians? Season 5, episode 3? What do you think? What do you think is going to happen next? I feel like the harmonic convergence is probably going to be a couple episodes away. Like, that's not going to happen immediately, but I do I feel like something's going to happen with Alice and Eliot that they're going to have to kind of tap into. So yeah, I think I want to see. I'm going to go on the ride, to see how this is going. Like I said, when I did the first of these recaps, this is super self-indulgent, but if you are a fan of The Magicians, like I am a fan of The Magicians, then you can definitely talk in the comments. If you found your way here by way of this video about The Magicians, welcome, thank you for joining, but stick around, there's some other content, so do a couple of things. One, subscribe. So that way you can be aware of when I release new videos about various things. But then second, take some time to check out some of the playlists, because I have some other videos that I have done. I talk about, of course, I am a big fan of sci-fi fantasy, hence I'm talking about the magicians. I'm also a horror buff, and I have a true horror series where I talk about different things that have happened in history, and the focus is on people of the African diaspora, so Black people, and not necessarily Black Americans all the time, but it'll be largely Black American. But yeah, I have a true horror series I just described. I have some other videos, so stick around. Glad to have you. But if you have some thoughts about The Magicians season 5 episode 3, drop them down below, and I will be back for my next recap of episode 4, and I'm looking forward to talking to you then.